I'm on the last part of this sourdough building guide that I have put together for you to learn from. This is my starter on day 6 in the morning. I did the last feeding yesterday or day 5 at night at 1 to 5 to 5 ratio. Then let the starter ferment at about 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for 12 hours. After 12 hours, the starter has reached its peak position, which is about 2.5 times its initial height. You can tell that it has passed its peak position because the surface is flat and it's full of air bubbles. It means the food source has been fully digested and is ready to be fed again. My star is already active, so I do not need to feed it too often, just like I did on the 5th day, because as you remember, I did 3 feedings on the 5th day just to measure the speed of fermentation. To make sure that the microbial activities are stable, I will spend 1 to 3 days, so from day 6 to around day 8, to maintain the starter by feeding it twice a day at 1 to 5 to 5 ratio. Then I let the starter ferment at lower temperature. Usually I choose somewhere between 18 to 21 degrees Celsius or 64 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That way the starter doesn't get hungry too quickly and I do not have to do too many feedings. If your starter doesn't rise today, you still can do feeding at 1 to 1 to 1 ratio and let the fermentation happens at warmer temperature between 28 to 30 degrees Celsius or 82 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, if your sourdough starter starts to rise, even if it's only a little bit, then follow my instructions in part 4 of the sourdough building guide. I'll put the link in the description. If you notice, my starter did not rise that high this morning compared to when I did the second feeding yesterday. It's because I only realized that I used the wrong amount of starter after the starter that I fed already set for about 30 minutes. That much time gave the gluten network in the starter to partly develop. So when I stirred in the additional starter, I did foldings that resembles kneading when I build bread dough. When gluten network is properly developed, whether in starter dough or bread dough, the dough itself will rise taller. So today, after I stir the starter, bread flour, and water, I let this new starter sit for about 30 minutes. Then I will do foldings which are similar to kneading bread dough, that is to develop gluten network in the dough so the dough can rise higher. Since this starter dough is very wet, I cannot knead it. That's why I do folding. I use spatula that I dip in the water so that the dough will not stick to the spatula. Folding is done by pulling the edges of the dough and then fold them toward the center. You do it several times until you have smoother dough. This folding sequence can be done once or twice depending on how much time you have. Usually I do 2 sequences of foldings. So after this first sequence of folding, I let the dough rest again for 20 to 30 minutes and then do the second folding sequence. I often tell my students that these foldings helps the starter rise taller, but it's not as important as the frequency of the feeding. After several years of sourdough baking, I learned that I get the best bread when I frequently feed my starter. I usually do 2 feedings in a day, just like what I do on the 6th day of sourdough building. After the first sequence of foldings and the second rest, my starter dough already looks smoother, which indicates that the gluten network has partly developed. So now I'm doing the second sequence of folding. If you feed a large amount of starter, you can do these foldings by hand. Before folding the dough, dip your hand in the water, just like I do with the spatula. That way, the starter dough doesn't stick to your hand. Again, these folding sequences are optional. I love doing it because it helps my starter rise higher and have bigger air bubbles. Because when gluten network is properly developed, the starter dough will be able to trap the gas that is produced during the fermentation a lot better. However, do not worry if your starter doesn't rise as high, because the more important signs of the starter's health is aroma and the speed of fermentation. If your starter is healthy, it will smell like a fermented bread dough, slightly sweet with a hint of acidity. And it should be able to peak within 6 hours or less after a feeding at 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. If your starter smells acidic, you will need to do several feedings to bring it back to its normal condition. Because when the starter has so much acids, the wild yeast will struggle and the starter will not be able to leaven your bread dough properly. That's why I said earlier that feeding frequency is a more important thing to pay attention to. This is my starter after the feeding in the morning and then 12 hours of fermentation. You can see that the air bubbles are a lot bigger than before because I did 2 sequences of folding. What I do next is repeating the same feeding that I did this morning. I use 1 to 5 to 5 ratio again. I'm also using the same amount of starter, that is 4 grams starter, and then I add 20 grams bread flour and 20 grams water. Since I will not use the starter to leaven bread dough yet, I do not need to feed a large amount of starter. You can do this for starter maintenance as well, so only feed as much as you need. If you don't need to bake bread, then just feed a small amount of starter. I will go into the details of starter maintenance in the next videos. Stay tuned, that way you don't miss any information. For the second feeding on the 6th day, I will also do folding sequence. So after I stir the starter, bread flour and water, I let the starter dough rest and then do the first folding sequence. Next, let the starter rest again for 20 to 30 minutes and perform the second folding sequence. Again, this is optional, but it helps your starter rise taller. The rest of the activities will be the same. So I repeat these 2 feedings day 1 or 2 more. It means on the 7th and the 8th day, I will do 2 feedings in one day at 1 to 5 ratio and choose the fermentation temperature around 18 to 21 degrees Celsius or 64 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Only then I will be able to do test bake by using the starter to leaven bread dough. For those who start still doesn't have much activity, just keep going with what you do, feeding at 1 to 1 ratio once a day until the starter shows a sign of activity. That means it's able to rise again. Then you can increase the feeding frequency, whether it's to twice a day or 3 times a day. Do not do more than 3 times feeding in a day. It will just make your starter sluggish from overfeeding. To summarize it, during the early stages or early days of sourdough building and also during the transition period, do 1 feeding a day at 1 to 1 ratio at warm temperature between 28 to 30 degrees Celsius or 82 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. After the starter starts to show activities again, you can do 1 to 3 feedings in a day. Increase the ratio such as 1 to 2 to 2 or 1 to 5 to 5 like I showed you. Also ferment the starter dough at lower temperature.